Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. For today's video, I will be talking about Russian revolutionary and radical writer Chernyshevsky and his novel What Is to Be Done. Casual dabblers of Russian literature and history often have no problem naming some of the greats of classical Russian fiction. Tolstoy's War and Peace, alongside his Anna Karenina and Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment, are often the first to come to mind. Those more passionate about this field may presumably also be familiar with names like Chekhov, Pushkin, Turgenev, or Gogol. When considering Russian revolutionary history, however, names like Lenin or Stalin usually first appear in the common Western mind, possibly alongside figures like Marx and Engels despite their non-Russian backgrounds. Russian writers of the revolutionary strain may not even occur at all. This conception of the Russian literary sphere, as I'm sure is obvious, is nowhere close enough to providing anything akin to a comprehensive scope of Russian literary or revolutionary history. To do so requires innumerable amounts of research, study, and time, but it also requires awareness of a man named Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who seems to have been widely forgotten even in the casual realm of Russian study in the West. Digging deeper into Chernyshevsky revealed to me the enormous political and historical impact he left in the wake of his writings. His last significant work, a novel titled What Is to Be Done, was so hugely influential on the Russian intellectual youth of the later 19th century that it sent droves of them to the Russian countryside in hopes of uniting the peasantry. Because of him, thousands took up the revolutionary mantle and fought for a new social, political, and economic order. One of these individuals, previously mentioned already in this video, was Lenin. The Russian Marxist theorist, revolutionary, and philosopher Georgy Plekhanov stated that, quote, "From the time that printing presses appeared in Russia up to our times, no single printed work has been as successful in Russia as What Is to Be Done." The anarchist Peter Kropotkin wrote that for the Russian youth of the time, the novel was a revelation and became a program. No other novel of Turgenev and no writings of Tolstoy or any other writer had ever had such a wide and deep influence upon Russian society as this novel had. Joseph Frank, in the Southern Review, said that What Is to Be Done was the 19th century Russian novel with the greatest influence on Russian society, and went so far as to write that, quote, "Chernyshevsky's novel, far more than Marx's Capital, supplied the emotional dynamic that eventually went to make the Russian Revolution." If all this is true, and Chernyshevsky was one of the Russian revolutionary greats, I ask of you the two following questions. Who was Chernyshevsky, and what was his novel What Is to Be Done? These two topics will serve as the main focuses for this video. To complete this, I will, in approximately this order, give an overview of Chernyshevsky first as a historical figure and then as a thinker. I will conceptualize the influences surrounding Chernyshevsky and attempt to provide a brief overview of the preceding text that inspired his work. I will provide the historical context of What Is to Be Done and examine it as a literary text. Lastly, I will connect the space between Chernyshevsky and his novel with the Russian populist movements and terrorist campaigns that characterized the last half-century prior to the overthrow of the Russian Empire in an attempt to emphasize and link the information of this video together. To start, I would like to begin with a biographical overview. Nikolai Chernyshevsky was a Russian literary and social critic, journalist, novelist, and socialist philosopher born in 1828. By the time his most influential work, a novel titled What Is to Be Done, was published in 1863, he had already established a reputation as an advocate of materialist philosophy, socialist political economy, and women's liberation. Raised by a poor priest, Chernyshevsky's upbringing, education, and relationship with his parents fostered in him, quote, "the intellectual vigor, commitment to ideas, stern moral integrity, ascetic habits, and concern for the welfare of others that marked both his personal character and his developed ideological beliefs." His post-secondary educational experience, which lasted 5 years at St. Petersburg University, led to the abandonment of both his orthodoxy and his acceptance of the Tsar's social political order. During this time, he officially studied literature and philology, but spent the majority of his energy on questions of philosophy, political economy, and the social role of literature with a small group of like-minded friends interested in the same radical intellectual pursuits. After his graduation, he pursued a journalistic career and married Olga Sokratinova, a relationship that helped him substantiate many of his ideas, particularly in regard to the emancipation of women. Chernyshevsky's unexpected talent as a literary critic and the popularity of his reviews in The Contemporary, a Russian literary, social, and political magazine, led to its publisher to offer Chernyshevsky a permanent position as its editor. This position allowed Chernyshevsky to become an influential critic of the injustices and deficiencies of the existing order, as well as a preeminent spokesman for radical social and political change. His personal popularity grew alongside that of the journal itself, extending the reach of his ideas and allowing him to gain a notable follower base. Chernyshevsky believed that literature and literary criticism could serve as powerful forces of historical progress, and asserted that literature should be judged solely on the basis of its fidelity to reality and its social utility, a view that garnered significant controversy. The various responses it provoked were shaped by social differences as much as philosophical and aesthetic agreements of such power that they exacerbated the conflict that was pushing apart moderate and radical intelligentsia. These disagreements were only widened by the reforms of Tsar Alexander II. Chernyshevsky, who aligned himself with the radicals, believed that Russia's social injustices and lack of development could not be overcome through evolutionary means, especially reforms taken by the Tsarist state. To him, the relationship of mutual dependence between the autocracy and privileged social groups meant that no meaningful state action would occur until the current structure of political power was redrawn. Unlike other radicals, however, Chernyshevsky believed that a successful revolution also required overturning the patriarchal relations that existed within the family as well as between social groups. Because of this view, he became an ardent advocate of women's rights as a means to pursue social revolution generally, and thereby helped to raise the women's question in 19th century Russia. The force of Chernyshevsky's opinions led him to condemn not only the inadequacy of the government's proposals, but also the moderate intelligentsia who supported those proposals, going so far as to question their integrity as well as their intelligence. In response, these moderates denounced Chernyshevsky as impractical and smeared his radicalism by giving it the power to possibly frighten the government away from the more realistic path of gradual reform. It was this conflict that led to the complete split between the moderate and radical thinkers in the Russian intelligentsia in Chernyshevsky's time. Nonetheless, Chernyshevsky made sure to remain within the boundaries set by state censorship and to avoid personal involvement in revolutionary activities while calling for radical social action. This careful rule abiding, however, was not enough to save him from the scrutiny of the Tsarist government, who blamed Russia's uptick of revolutionary and student activism in the early 1860s on the Contemporary and its radical, well-known editor. This, combined with Chernyshevsky's will for ignorance of warnings that had commanded him to moderate the journal's political baseline, led to his arrest in 1862 on largely fabricated charges and the forced closure of the journal. In 1864, he was convicted of subversion, largely on the basis of false evidence, and sentenced to 14 years of hard labor followed by permanent exile. He spent the next 18 years of his life in prison or in eastern Siberia, far away from friends, family, or any source of intellectual stimulation. It was during the time spent awaiting trial in the Peter-Paul fortress that he wrote his last significant and most influential work, the novel titled What Is to Be Done. As a thinker, Chernyshevsky is best described as a utopian socialist. He envisioned a prosperous agrarian utopia that could be brought forth by the transformation of traditional social institutions through materialist philosophy, utilitarian ethics, science, and technology. This end goal, which would come into existence through the efforts of the educated elite, would theoretically satisfy both the material welfare of the masses and the creative needs of the intellectuals. It also promised to resolve the tensions produced by educational reform, Western European competition and cultural intrusion, and the advent of secularization and the impact of science in a still predominantly agrarian Christian Russia. Chernyshevsky also subscribed heavily to British utilitarianism, believing that all human behavior was motivated by the desire to maximize personal pleasure and to avoid pain. Because human behavior was thus universal, differences in the behavior of people could be explained only by the different ways in which their socioeconomic environment led them to act in pursuit of their self-interest. As such, good and evil were relative terms based on whether the actions being judged were perceived as beneficial or harmful by the person judging them. To Chernyshevsky, this conflict of morality could be best resolved by maximizing the pleasure of the largest number of people, thereby bringing the greatest benefit to society. Those he considered enlightened individuals thus recognized that the maximization of society's interests also best served their own personal interests. Service to the community was therefore the way for enlightened individuals to achieve personal self-fulfillment. Chernyshevsky was also concerned with ideas of true reality in relation to his utopia. He thought that religious belief and philosophical idealism impeded progress toward his envisioned end by producing false images of human nature. He additionally thought that idealist notions of pure art or beauty were not simply false but dangerous because they obscured reality and subordinated it to an unrealizable ideal. Due to these perspectives, he believed human progress required both the constant advancement of scientific understanding and the elimination of institutions that perpetuated ignorance. His evaluation of art on the basis of its faithfulness to reality and its ability to expand knowledge informed his writing of What Is to Be Done, where he sought not only to explain reality but change it by providing radical youth with guidelines for social behavior and political actions. He was part of a growing group of thinkers that saw art as pointless unless it served an end purpose, like societal reflection, and looked down on things a generation before him revered, like aesthetics and beauty. Economically, Chernyshevsky defended cooperative socialism and critiqued capitalist individualism. He argued that a political economy based on cooperative labor and collective ownership would satisfy individual and societal needs more effectively than either capitalist or czarist economic political orders. This was because, under a cooperative socialist order, the pursuit of self-interest coincided with the goal of improving collective societal welfare. He also believed his system would expand economic output because work would be completed more efficiently with a group than by individual efforts. He additionally theorized that people were more productive when they directly reaped the rewards of their labor and made this one of his requirements for his conception of cooperative socialism. From this, it's possible to see that Chernyshevsky romanticized manual labor and thought that it constituted a person's chief source of personal pleasure. This perspective led him to conclude that capitalist and czarist political orders depress a society's overall welfare by preventing the majority of its members from achieving their full productive potential, especially in regards to women, who were banned from intellectual or economic pursuits under both systems but would finally be free under his. He concluded that socialist transformation and economic growth could only be achieved through a social transformation that destroyed patriarchal relations within the family and society. This burden was placed on the younger, radical members of the intelligentsia, in other words, the only ones Chernyshevsky believed were capable of guiding the subsequent transformation of society, since moderate thinkers held too much loyalty to the Tsar's order to ever risk real change. His faith in these intelligentsia, who he thought of as the new people, testified to his belief that history was moved at least as much by ideas as by material forces. Contextually, What Is to Be Done was written as a response to Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, and in turn inspired Dostoevsky's reply in the form of his own novel famously titled Notes from the Underground. Because this video covers Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done and not Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, I won't go into a deep dive of this also incredibly important text. I will also refrain from any exploration of Dostoevsky, who I personally believe deserves at the very least his own individual video. The basics of Fathers and Sons, however, are as such. Ivan Turgenev's acclaimed literary work is a novel predicated on the ideological clash between two generations, namely the fathers and the sons. In this context, Turgenev's fathers represent the Russian liberals of the 40s, who were perceived by Turgenev's sons as ineffectual idealists with stagnant and aristocratic values, a huge insult coming from those who looked down on Russia's Tsar and Tsarist systems. Turgenev's sons, therefore, were Russia's radicals, more specifically, the men of the 60s. These individuals were perceived by the fathers as rebels instead of revolutionaries, and in their eyes characterized by blatant, uncaring disrespect and what was constructed as stupid, naive extremism. Turgenev wrote Fathers and Sons in the period just before the rise of Russian nihilism. He, like those around him, were very aware of the shifting political patterns of the mid-19th century and wanted to contribute to this changing environment. Previously, before Turgenev, very little literature had explored the barriers between Russia's highly segregated social classes, and in many ways Turgenev was the vanguard where the literary depiction of collapsing social barriers was concerned. His creation of the character Bazarov, the revolutionary of the novel and one of its main characters, was born out of his desire to create a true Russian hero distinct from the protagonists that had come in the famous literature before him. Because this hero, an educated but non-aristocratic Russian man proud to call himself a nihilist, and one with values completely anti-ethical to Turgenev's own, had not yet come to full existence in Russian society, Turgenev's Bazarov was akin to a prototype of the emerging revolutionary. With this significant literary and political background, it at once becomes clear that there were huge expectations among the revolutionary youth that Turgenev's new novel would finally deliver an unequivocal positive hero on whom they could project their hopes and dreams. In this, Fathers and Sons was a huge disappointment. Russian radicals were outraged by the way Turgenev had characterized them through Bazarov, and Russian liberals were equally angry over their own depictions through the novel's older generation. In Fathers and Sons, the most unflattering conceptions of both generations were drawn, and because the ending was anticlimactic and rather uninspirational, it found no favor with either camp. Most likely this failure is due to Turgenev's talent as a writer instead of a political thinker, and this theory is backed up by the fact that many of the reasons contributing to the firm revolutionary rejection of Bazarov were the same reasons that made him excel as a literary character. For Russian youth looking for a figure to idolize, Bazarov's general inconsistency, irritating ambivalence, and constant contradiction combined with the absolutely unenviable and entirely boring climax of his character are repulsive things and impossible to want to emulate. For readers, writers, and literary critics, however, these were traits that made him complex and perfect for theoretical analysis and discussion. It was in the wake of this failure that Chernyshevsky published What Is to Be Done, and unlike Turgenev, he didn't make the same mistake of humiliating his characters. Unlike Bazarov, Chernyshevsky's revolutionary is uncompromising, dead serious, and entirely committed to the cause. His one vice, his love of smoking, only makes his character bigger, undoubtedly increasing reader desire to be just like him. What Is to Be Done had such widespread impact and revolutionary power that Vladimir Lenin, founder of the Bolsheviks and leader of the 1917 Russian Revolution, when crafting his own piece on writing focused on the ideological formation of the proletariat, gave it the identical name of What Is to Be Done in homage to Chernyshevsky. What Is to Be Done therefore represents the best known and most comprehensive statement of Chernyshevsky's ideas. Through it, he exerted extraordinary influence on generations of Russian radicals. The actions, efforts, and lives of these radicals, as well as those who lived alongside them and opposed them, cannot be fully understood without understanding the book they hailed as their holy text. On the differing perspectives of the intelligentsia of Chernyshevsky's time, Lenin wrote, "The liberals of the 1860s and Chernyshevsky were representative of two historical tendencies and forces which to this day have been determining the issue of struggle for the new Russia." On Chernyshevsky himself, Lenin wrote, Chernyshevsky was not only a utopian socialist, but a revolutionary democrat who approached all the political events of his time with a revolutionary spirit. He was able to exercise a revolutionary influence by advocating, in spite of all the barriers and obstacles placed in his way by the censorship, the idea of the struggle of the masses for the overthrow of all the old authorities. Regarding the moderate liberal intelligentsia that fought bitter ideological battles with their radical counterparts while shunning Chernyshevsky's writings and ways of thinking, Lenin wrote, "The liberals wanted to emancipate Russia from above, taking care not to destroy either the monarchy or the czars, or the property rights and the rule of the landowners, prevailing upon them only to make concessions in spirit of the times. The liberals were, and still are, the ideologists of the bourgeoisie. Afraid of revolution, they confined themselves to the struggle for reform, that is to say, a struggle for a division of power between the feudal landowners and the bourgeoisie." After his fierce critique of Russian liberals, Lenin then aligned himself with Chernyshevsky's radicalism in the same work, writing the following section. In speaking of Tsar Alexander II's reforms, which the liberals at first tried to whitewash and subsequently even glorified, Chernyshevsky described the reforms as vile, for he clearly saw its feudal nature, and that the liberal emancipators were robbing the peasants of their last shirt. On the other hand, What is to be Done, when interpreted solely as a literary text, appears to be a deceptively simple story. It revolves around a young woman named Vera Pavlovna who managed to escape the control of her tyrannical mother through an arranged marriage that allows her economic independence. In the chapters that follow, the novel explores her ambitions, relationships, and daily life. There's no great climax or action-packed conflict, and the distress she suffers at the beginning of the text with her family serves more as a way to further her storyline instead of being an actual source of emotional connection between her and readers of the text. Nonetheless, the book's arguable blandness fails to distract from Chernyshevsky's subtle calls to revolution and his conceptions of a utopic world. What is to be Done has received tremendous critique as a literary work, and some scholars go so far as to debate if it even fits the guidelines of a novel because of its perceived lack of plot and inherent artlessness. One critic even went so far as to call it the most atrocious work of Russian literature, and a 19th century Russian literary historian, critic, and memorist affiliated with the Russian Narodnik movement even attested to rumors that the Tsar's censors had permitted the novel's publication in the hope that such a highly inept work of art would ruin Chernyshevsky's reputation. Alexander Herzen, known as the father of Russian socialism and one of the greatest thinkers in the tradition of Russian socialist intellectualism, said that the beautiful thoughts in What is to be Done did not change the fact that it was basely written. Sonia A. Werner, in her article titled "The Reality Effect and the Real Effects of Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done," described how the novel was often branded as a political treatise or radical propaganda that donned fictitious clothes. The afterword of my edition of Turgenev's Fathers and Sons reads, "Strictly speaking, Chernyshevsky's work can't be called a novel. It is poorly written, simply a load of verbal and thematic rubbish lumped together in one great heap, completely lacking any artistic merit and only of interest these days as a historical document. It is prolix and filled with bombast. Everything artistic was sincerely rejected." Additionally, Lenin's high praise and his endorsement of Chernyshevsky as his favorite Russian novelist did not stop the majority of Soviet critics from conceptualizing What is to be Done as a political tract instead of a novel. Nonetheless, the fact remains that What is to be Done was more than a bestseller. Sonia Werner wrote that it swept through Russia like wildfire, capturing the attention of everyone and anyone. In particular, What is to be Done resonated strongly with a small group within Russian society known as the Raznochinsy, a class of educated individuals separated from the nobility. Russian youth thus judged the novel not off its aesthetic merit, but rather on its usefulness in providing a program of action, or a guide to life. It would not be an exaggeration, it was written, to say that the novel was read practically on bended knee, with the kind of piety that does not permit the slightest smile on the lips, the kind with which sacred books are read. The novel had a colossal effect on our society. The Russian journalist, editor, and publisher that took over the Contemporary magazine where Chernyshevsky had worked as an editor after his arrest, wrote that manna from heaven never brought so much joy to the starving as this novel brought to the young people who had previously been wandering aimlessly around Petersburg. It was just like a vision sent from on high. In real life, they began to do exactly what they were supposed to do according to the sense of the novel. The hugely consequential nature of What is to be Done, and its inseparable ability from Russian intellectual life in the later 19th century is perhaps best exemplified by Professor at Odessa University, who in 1879 wrote that in my 16 years at the university, I never did meet a student who had not read the famous novel while he was in school. A 5th or 6th grade girl was considered a fool if she was unacquainted with the adventures of Vera Pavlovna. In this respect, the works, for example, of Turgenev or Goncharov, not to mention Gogol or Pushkin, are far behind the novel What is to be Done. In fact, What is to be Done was so successful that it was highly influential in the Narodnik movement of the 1860s or the Going to the People campaigns, where intellectual urban elite left their city lives and traveled to the Russian countryside in hopes of educating the peasantry on socialist ideology and the eventual overthrow of the Tsar. For many reasons, this campaign was a complete failure and exists as a small footnote in the huge expanse of Russian history. Nonetheless, the Narodniki profoundly shaped Russian radicalism and contributed to and shaped the terrorist campaigns that led to the assassination of Tsar Alexander and the eventual overthrow of the Russian Empire. Vasily Ossipanov, one of those charged with the murder of Alexander II, even slept on a bed of nails just like the revolutionary hero of What Is to Be Done. For a final paper in a class that I took, I went on a deep dive on one underexplored reason that I personally believe contributed to Narodniki failure. If you're interested in my research in the failure of the Narodniki and in their general history, I implore you to stick around. I was unable to fit everything I wanted to share about What Is to Be Done and the Narodniki into one video, even though I really wanted to do so because it was just too much information. As such, my next video will concern my thesis on the Russian Narodniki movement, revolve around Chernyshevsky's interpretation of Russia's notorious women's question, and serve as a part 2 to the information provided here. If you have watched this entire video and are watching me now, I extend to you my sincere thanks. I'm very aware of myself as a frustratingly sporadic and sometimes lackluster content creator, but I'm so grateful to have an audience with which I can share things that I can't really share with anyone else. The interactions I've had on this channel have truly solidified my passion for Russian literature and history, and for that I'll be forever grateful. Because I have been absent for so long, I anticipate that this video will do extremely badly. To help offset this, I sincerely ask that you leave a like and a comment, whether it be to just say hello, to give me your thoughts on this video, or to ask any questions you may have on this topic. If you're feeling very generous, I would be forever appreciative if you sent this video to a friend or to someone you think would find enjoyable. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you all soon.